So there's a lot to get through in terms of trying to explain the content and the writing style associated with the introduction and what comes within the introduction, as in the review of literature for the research project. So this would very much constitute part of your planning, and perhaps also the production, the produce part of this project, in that you'll do a lot of background reading and then ultimately write it up when you're producing your research project. So again, the scenario was you're on a placement at BASES and you're needing to carry out a bit of either quantitative or qualitative research. So the introduction really, I've separated this kind of into two parts, but they very much overlap. The introduction explores topics and defines key terms. So this kind of takes the reader on the start of the journey as to where this project is going, what are the key topics central to your research, and what are important defining terms that they need to understand. For example, if you were going to talk about VO2 max, then you'd need to define it in the introduction. The review of literature then goes a little bit further and involves you doing your secondary research and linking background readings of other people's research to the topics that you've identified as key to your project. And then secondly, you're going to actually be evaluating those research that you look at, so other people's research, and discussing how credible they are, whether they're valid or reliable, whether they're directly linked to yours or just similar, and trying to draw out as much similarity as possible to make connection between yours and theirs. You'll then refer to these later when you discuss your results. So it's important you've got quite sort of strong secondary research as part of this part of the process. And it ends up being, 1,500 to 2,000 words ish. It probably shouldn't be less, but it sometimes is a little bit more than that. So in sum, what is the introduction part of this section? It's the broad context of your research area. So broadly, what are you looking at? Are you looking at participation levels in physical activity? You describe the main topics within that, and then you might gradually draw in and focus in more small and more specific areas. So you start very broad and then begin to focus. What this says about signposting is basically telling the reader where you are going to go in your research, but also giving them the scope of your project, where you're not going to go, what are the boundaries of your project. Specifically then, the review of literature part of this is a select analysis of existing research which is relevant to your topic, showing how it relates to your investigation. So what have other people done, how did they do it, and what did they find out, and linking that to your specific investigation areas. You might want to I'm not going to go through each one of these, but you might want to pause and just have a closer look at this purpose of the review of literature. So this may be a way of understanding how the review of literature needs to work. So you start again very broad, so you explore general issues and areas of of your research topics. You then progressively narrow that research and focus on any studies which are specifically relevant to yours, and the others are then beyond the scope of your research, so you leave them be. So you focus on ones that are more relevant, and finally specifically focus and hone in on those that are directly relevant to your investigation. So it's kind of start broad and then fine tune until you're just really looking at and evaluating studies which are more closely linked to your research. So given that your project may have a sort of central broad theme, and then you may figure out that there are associated sort of subtopics and maybe even subtopics, this might be a way, this mind mapping process might be a way of organising the sections of your review of literature, organising and having clarity as to the bits that you're going to look into, because there might be more than one section. There's also a piece of software called Inspiration 8, which certainly has been on a lot of college computers, which is a way that you can basically make your own mind maps on the computers, and it's a really nice visual way of organising yourself. Now, given that your project might be quite vast or might have a lot of separate subtopics, it's very much okay for you to organise them into headings. So your review of literature might have headinged sections, which of course you have to relate to your project, but might need separating and organising. So check that they all link together. All that they ultimately need to flow in and link to your project. And remember that you're looking at them quite critically, and you're looking to see about how they approach their project, what sample size did they have, what tests did they use to analyse their data, what methodology, protocols did they use, and seeing if there were any strengths or weaknesses that you can tease out for these. So look quite critically at them. But basically this previous research will help you give reason to why you're looking at what you're looking at. So you might be looking at similar elements to previous research. You might find that there's a gap in research, and that's why you're studying something. So in brief then, at the end of your review of literature, you should be in a position to summarise the current state of research, what other people have done, possibly identify any gaps in that research or things that may need further research, and therefore linking, well, why are you doing what you're doing? How does it relate to that? Again, clearly at the end, the latter part of your introduction, your review of literature, you need to be stating the aims of your study. So you've done what everybody else has done, and now you're saying, well, actually, I'm going to be studying this, or this project will consider, you won't be using I because that's not the right writing style, but you're going to basically state your research question or questions associated with your piece of study, and the hypotheses, if it's appropriate, to link in with your study. Here's sort of a flow chart. So again, pause the video, have a look at these, and try to get a sense of the process of doing things. You'd start by simply making a list of any relevant topics or areas associated with your research interest. Make notes on them, keep a database of where you find sources of information, because you'll have to put that in your bibliography. Try to use a variety of sources, not just the internet. Textbooks are totally credible, are sort of the resource books that we have in class. Don't forget PubMed, Google Scholar and PP Online. Remember that you need to be evaluating the pieces of information that you research, and check if they're credible or not. And these pieces of research will have been used, and you're using what other people have done to shape how you're going to do your project. And ultimately then you'll be summarising what you found out in the context of your project. All the way through this, you need to make sure that you link everybody else's literature to your research question and your project, and state its relevance to your project. Again, pause, have a look at this as a process, but it gives you a fairly clear idea of how to go about writing the review of literature. So where do you start? You start by looking at what research has already been done, what are the sub-areas or the subtopics that you need to explore. Check those subtopics out in terms of other people's literature, making sure that you link it to how it overlaps with your investigation, and jot down some ideas. The flow chart, the mind map is exactly what I would recommend in terms of getting clarity for yourself. It's important that you keep a critical eye when you read other people's work, and you determine whether they're in support of your research, or finding the similar sort of things, or there's a counter argument to it. And remember to think about the methods of which they collect their information and how they did their research, and was it valid and reliable. So sources of information, I think it's pretty important that you use these as you might do at university. So we've had a little bit of experience looking at things on PubMed. Essentially, type it in Google, you'll find it, and then you type in your sort of keywords or relevant words, and it kicks out abstracts typically associated with those keywords. There are lots of journals that you might use. Now, some don't give you access unless you pay, but many do. So these are very much on the higher end of credibility in terms of including in your project. Peak Performance Online, again, many of you have already looked on this. Lots of good sports science based articles. Your textbook and other associated textbooks, so there are some psychology and some physiology textbooks available in the library and in our classroom resources. And be cautious really of how you use the internet. Wiki is really helpful in terms of getting yourself some understanding, but it's absolutely not a credible site for you to quote in your review of literature or use there. And again, Google Scholar is a very good source of information. Remember that your sources and where you get your information, you will have to put into a bibliography, and there is a format in which you must do your bibliography. You know, it is absolutely essential, especially if you're going on to university, that you get this right. I certainly expect you to get this right. So in summary, the functions of the review of literature, basically it gives credit to people who have done the groundwork for your research, so the previous research. You demonstrate that you understand your research question. You demonstrate that you understand any theoretical or key bits of literature and information and knowledge that underpin your research. Shows that you can be critical because you're looking at other people's literature quite critically. That you're able to integrate and synthesize, so bring together other people's work and link it into yours. That you be able to think independently and perhaps look at questioning things and bringing in your own ideas, maybe proposing a new theoretical model. And at the end of the day, you're giving some justification as to why you're researching what you're researching. Perhaps because there's a gap in the literature already, or you think something needs researching in greater depth or with a slightly different slant on things. Here's an introduction of a sort of a snippet of an introduction, just to give you a sense of writing style. It is quite formulaic, it is very formalised, but I will again give you further support in how to write for the research project, because it is quite a specific writing style. Here's another example of literally the first paragraph of an introduction. So I suggest for both of those you pause the video and have a read, try to understand how it's different from perhaps some of your other assignments. Writing style, as I've just mentioned, needs to be very objective, very factual, very formal and scientific. There's no personal comments. You're not writing in a diary, you're not writing to me, you're not writing as you would speak to your friends. It's very much in the third person, so you don't talk about I or me or we did this or we did that. You'd have to make it third person, so you'd say subjects participated in this, subjects did this. So again, that will come with practice, and it's typically written in the past tense. Just to briefly then, before I finish, to give you a sense of perhaps writing style, how it can be more descriptive, but what we want is more analytical. So have a look at these examples here. This is a descriptive, this is a more analytical writing style, and this is what I'm very much looking for, particularly in the when you're looking at other people's research and also in your own discussion. Just be mindful then, lastly, these are some things that can go wrong. If your review of literature can lack organisational structure, it's just some sprawling mass of other people's work that you haven't made into sensible subheadings or subtitles. It might lack focus, it might lack link, connection, it might just be sort of thrown in, not related to your research question. Sometimes things can be quite repetitive. Some topics have very key theorists who you would expect to hear about, especially in things like sports psychology, where certain researchers have looked at certain topics. If some of the secondary research is particularly old and it's not more recent, that might be questioned. If you don't look critically at other people's research, if you just accept what they said as sort of absolutely true, that's not particularly good practice. Or if you cite or include quite irrelevant secondary research, that also is not going to do too well.